Banner, 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 Batman. Batman. Or so went the iconic 1960s Batman series theme tune starring Adam West. So why do I bring back that theme tune? Well, it was the series was infamously a bit of a comedy of errors with a bit over the top and very tongue-in-cheek with a lot of humour. Very different to the current dark setting for Batman. Unfortunately, as you're about to find in this Gaming Nightmare video, this is the second instalment, that Batman does appear to have been in a few Gaming Nightmares himself, and this game is probably worse than anything you've ever seen before, as we take a look at the Sega Saturn's release of Batman Forever. Now, before you PlayStation fans start laughing away at how bad this game looks, you should be aware it also got released on the PS1 as well, and yes, it does play as bad as it looks. So, for those who don't know, Batman is an iconic comic book character first created in 1939. Since then, he's gone on to appear in countless films, books, TV shows and video games. Historically, Batman's actually had a pretty good run of video games, truth be told. While Superman, his fellow DC characters, had a pretty rough ride, with almost every video game he's ever been in being pretty appalling, Batman always had a pretty good range of games. Starting originally on the ZX Spectrum in 1986 with the isometric Batman Adventure game, following up with Batman the Cape Crusader in 1988. Later games included the Ocean film tie-in on the Commodore Amiga and other home formats, followed by a few Sunsoft Batman-based games, and probably one of the more iconic ones that I'm going to reference, as you'll see in this video now, is the Konami Batman Returns game on the Super Nintendo, which was an all-action scrolling beat-em-up. And the reason I'm referencing this is because Batman Forever is also a scrolling beat-em-up like Batman Returns. However, Konami show exactly how Acclaim, who made Batman Forever, should have made their scrolling beat-em-up, as this beat-em-up by Konami is a vastly better game. In fact, Konami actually did a couple of other good games also based on Batman the Animated Series as well. The Adventures of Batman and Robin, as some of the games were called. Now, there are a couple of other Batman Returns games and Batman Adventures of Robin games that aren't as good. There's a mix. The Mega Drive version of Batman Returns was infamously appallingly bad, as was the Amiga version. In fact, probably the worst era for Batman games is probably from the Sega Saturn and PS1 era up to the Xbox 360, as even during the GameCube, PlayStation 2 and Xbox era we saw some pretty ropey games, none the least being the absolutely awful Kemco developed game Batman The Dark Tomorrow, which was widely derided as one of the worst games ever made. In fact, it was so bad the developers even infamously pulled their discussion forum from their website about the game. So on with Batman Forever. Batman Forever is of course based on the Joel Schumacher film of the same name, and actually saw a release on a number of different platforms. Now, I'm not going to talk about any of the other games because basically the PS1 and the Sega Saturn versions are the one we're looking at, and they are based on the 1995 arcade game by Acclaim. Now, some of you may think, hang on, didn't Acclaim not actually make that many arcade games? And you'd be right, because Acclaim actually joined the arcade industry pretty late. In fact, 1995 appears to have been the year they first commercially released an arcade game, and yes, this appears to have been their first commercial release from what I can gather. Which was probably not a good sign to begin with, as by 1995 the arcade industry was historically beginning to go quite heavily into decline, so actually joining it at this point was a pretty poor decision. Indeed, looking at Acclaim's arcade history, it appears they literally only made a handful of arcade games and actually finished arcade production in '97, indicating how badly made this decision was to move into the arcade industry. And as you can see, Batman Forever takes on the role of a scrolling beat-em-up, a genre that had been pretty much perfected since the early 90s, late 80s, with games such as Double Dragon leading the initial way, and then Konami taking up and leading the way with titles such as The Turtles, The Simpsons, and Capcom doing things like Aliens vs Predator, Dungeons and Dragons, and Captain Commando, and of course Final Fight. These games were like the pinnacle of the genre and got everything down perfectly. Unfortunately, Acclaim seemed to have made some key fundamental errors in a scrolling beat-em-up. And while the port is fairly decent from the arcade version, there are a few downgrades, notably the blocky graphics. Although the strange thing here is that Batman Forever, the arcade game, is actually based on the Sega Titan board, which is in fact the Sega Saturn arcade hardware. The only difference is a slightly more RAM. Other than that, it should have practically been a straight port, so the huge graphical downgrade is a bit of an odd one, especially when you consider Die Hard Arcade, which also used the Titan board, is nigh on perfect port, warts and all, and including all the graphic upgrades. So this graphical downgrade comes at quite a surprise. I'm actually more impressed, to be honest, with the fact that I actually managed to get it to run on the PlayStation due to the fact that it used the Sega Saturn hardware, so I can only assume Acclaim recoded the entire game. As you see, the graphics overall are very blocky and murky and really don't do the game justice. They just look ugly. They're the classic digitalised actor look as well, so on a balanced digitalised actors, unless done really well like in Mortal Kombat, has aged really badly and just makes the game look dated and just ugly, quite frankly. I mean, even games like Donkey Kong Country, which used early CG, still looked really good, but this just looks like a mess. Right, so next up, one of the next many problems with Batman Forever is the complete lack of enemies in the game. As you'll see through the playthrough, it's just horrible. It's just the same enemies practically over and over again. There's a handful of enemies, there's a handful of bosses. They all look very similar. They all pretty much play the same. A couple of them shoot, a couple of them are robots, but aside from that, they pretty much all have the same sort of animation and attacks, and it gets very repetitively very quickly. Add to this, and the main flaw with the game is that this is a scrolling beat 'em up, so you'd expect the collision to be spot on. As you'll see from a few clips in this video as I'm running through, quite often your punches and kicks will just go straight through the enemy, which is a big problem in a scrolling beat 'em up because your new punches and kicks need to collect. In fact, it's a fundamental flaw with the game that should not be in this type of game. If it's in this type of game, it means it's completely broken. And that's exactly what happens. There are countless times where you throw punches and your character fist just goes through the enemy. They just sit there looking at you or then counter-attack and hit you. So I have to say it makes the game brutally hard because of it. And I ended up, as you can see from a lot of this video, playing through the game as Robin, as I discovered that he had a spin kick maneuver that basically you could abuse like mad because it had so many frames of invulnerable animation. In fact, trying to beat the game without using this spin kick was nigh on impossible, I found, because simply half the time you try to land punches, your punches would miss and you would just get clobbered back straight away. And the other thing is the enemy's kick will do like 1 or 2 hits and put you in a lock combo that basically takes your health down to, you lose like half your health in like 2-3 hits, so it is brutally hard. There just really isn't much going for that. Add to that this bizarre and really weird power-up system. You'll notice I grab a ton of bat symbols and then you'll just see me do this spectacular like explosion animation, and not only that, but every time you grab enough power-ups it does this animation constantly and you can't skip it, and it actually after a while gets on your wick. In fact, I must have seen this animation about 50 times during my playthrough. That's right, I used the word playthrough because I abused the Robin spin kick tactic so much that I was able to finish it in one go. I did try it with Batman, but Batman's moves were pretty lackluster. It was only Robin who had this spin kick that was basically quarter circle towards and kick. It was found the only way to actually defeat any of the enemies, and basically that's all I did for the entire game. And this was only the 3rd time I'd ever actually played this game, and I actually managed to play through from start to finish merely abusing the spin kick attack. Which also kind of skews the difficulty because it means that trying to use normal punches and kicks, I explained, is just impossible, but using this spin kick attack makes it ridiculously easy so long as you don't get stuck too often in the corner, because occasionally I'd find the enemies would come up close to you and sometimes you'd get them the spin kick, other times they'd hit you just as they came out of the spin kick. Either way, it's a pretty lamentable game overall. There is a power-up system that do work, kind of. Well, they're supposed to give you abilities and hits. They're just rubbish really. There was one that was quite funny that gave you holographic power-ups, and there's another one where you do the bat swing and basically get to kick all the enemies around and none of them can hurt you, but aside from that it's just one huge mess. It vaguely follows the plot of the film the game, or at least tries to, and interestingly enough I noticed that both the Riddler and Two-Face appear to have the voices ripped directly from the film, so there appears to have been sound samples taken directly from Jim Carrey and Tommy Lee Jones's performances. As for Batman and Robin, well, they appear to have been revoiced over by different actors, so you don't get to hear either Val Kilmer or Chris O'Donnell. It's fair to say Batman Forever wasn't the greatest film, but this game is absolutely diabolical. It shows everything wrong with a scrolling beat-em-up, and for a 1995 scrolling beat-em-up, it's just utterly unforgivable. There's just no excuse for these type of problems in this type of genre at this point. By now, developers like Capcom had completely mastered the genre and had Konami, so for Acclaim to produce this game is just a complete joke. It's no wonder barely any arcade owners actually stocked this game at all. In fact, I remember seeing it once or twice when I was on vacation in America once. I never saw it in the UK, that was for sure. It's easy to see why. It was just as abysmal in the arcade as it is on the Sega Saturn. It's pretty much, ironically, an arcade perfect port, but it's just a terrible game. Everything from even the damp squid intro, just some vague passing shots of the Batmobile, no sort of looming Batman fighting villains, no, it's just some random shots of a really crap looking Batmobile. Yes, I did say the Batman Forever Batmobile was pretty crap looking, and it is. So, looking at this diabolical monster, what should have you been playing on the Saturn? Well, of course, there is, as I mentioned slightly earlier, Die Hard Arcade, Sega's fantastic scrolling beat-em-up. Die Hard Arcade was actually it's a semi sort of follow-up to Golden Axe. So they took all their experiences from making the Golden Axe games and just put them into a sort of modern fighting game. Of course, Die Hard Arcade, as it's known in Japan, was Dynamite Deku, or Dynamite Cop, as the later sequel was called. But it's a fantastic scrolling beat-em-up. The game's just perfectly balanced, and skillful players can play through the entire game on one credit without any problems. There's a huge variety of weapons to pick up and gear, and there's so much moves at your disposal. There's plenty to do, plenty of options. It's a brilliant game and gets the whole scrolling beat-em-up genre perfectly. It's not a particularly long game, but it's still a very enjoyable one. Another iconic scrolling beat-em-up, one that many regard as actually one of the best scrolling beat-em-ups of all time, is of course Treasure's Guardian Heroes. There is just so much to say about this game. It is a huge scrolling beat-em-up, crossed slightly with an RPG. Basically, the player has multiple levels to go through. You choose routes through your level as you make decisions which way you want to go. This can alternate. This of course then affects which ending you see, which bosses you face. It is a colossal game. There are so many routes to go, and it takes weeks of gameplay to see everything. It's just a superb beat 'em up. The combat's fantastic, everything worked, it's perfectly balanced. It's 2 players, there's multiple characters to select and unlock, and not only that, there was even an awesome verse mode added in, so once you finish the single player, you could unlock characters in an awesome 2-player verse, in an awesome multiplayer verse mode. Everything is just spot on here, and Treasure got the game just right. And it shows exactly what is wrong with Batman Forever. Now, I'm not going to talk about any of the Japanese scrolling beat-em-ups, I'm mainly going to stick to the European ones, so no Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm not going to mention Heaven and Earth Warriors. There's a few others, Hot-Blooded Children as well, or the Techno-Soft beat-em-up, which isn't bad, but I'm not going to display any of them. Some of you may be thinking, oh, why haven't you mentioned 3 Dirty Dwarfs? As you can see, I'm just quickly running a quick video of it. 3 Dirty Dwarfs isn't a bad scrolling beat-em-up, it's a bit overrated. It's nice that it's 3-player. It's not actually that good a game. It's got some great set-piece boss battles, such as there's a great gym battle. There's another one you fight a dragon later on. But it's not actually that much fun. It's a very long and laborious game, I found, so it's not a great set-piece. It's worth the play, but it's certainly not worth picking up over Die Hard Arcade or Guardian Heroes, given the choice. It is, however, better than Batman Forever. So, is there anything positive about Batman Forever? Well, no, quite frankly not. It's a terrible game to go with a pretty average film. But there is just no excuse for this type of colossal failure, and it's fair to say that Acclaim really did have a lot to blame. In fact, there's an infamous saying in the games industry when Acclaim were about that where there's blame, there's Acclaim, and sure enough, there's plenty of blame here. In fact, don't just take my word for it, take the words for the original official Sega Saturn magazine review by Lee Nutter. Admittedly, they were surprisingly generous with their score of 63%, but in Lee Nutter's own words, I also found the collision detection to be a bit unpredictable, sometimes hitting opponents nowhere near you, other times punches and kicks simply passing right through them. For me, this is a poor man's Guardian Heroes. except that it's actually quite expensive. I can't really recommend this to anyone unless you're a die-hard Batman fan and a misogynist one at that, if such people exist. Batman Forever? I don't think so. Batman for a couple of hours is more realistic. So, and finally, just to leave you with one more quote from Lee Nutter from the official Sega Saturn magazine, which I think sums up the later films and the games in the series. My hopes are now pinned on the loved Dr. George Clooney to do Batman the justice it deserves. Sadly, Lee, as we all found out, George Clooney did anything but give Batman the justice he deserved, and what on earth were they thinking putting nipples on the bat suits? Ultimately, video game wise, it was left up to Rocksteady in the Arkham Asylum series to bring back Batman the good name it deserved, and of course, as we've seen in the recent years, Rocksteady have produced some very, very good games. It's just a shame they let Warner Brothers do a abysmal prequel outing in the form of Batman Arkham Origins, which is an absolute buggy mess and a tarnish on Rocksteady's good reputation with the other Arkham games. Fortunately, the conclusion of Rocksteady's Arkham Asylum trilogy will hopefully be out later in this year, but much like Arkham Origins, Batman Forever is just one game too many in the franchise. Unfortunately for all us Batman film fans, Christopher Nolan came along and did a superb trilogy with Batman Begins.